Some roads were never meant to be easy. They were cut into rock faces, laid across ridgelines, suspended above valleys, were never meant to be margin for error. They were cut into rock faces, laid across ridgelines. They exist because connection demanded were never between villages, for error, between nations, between isolated communities and the rest of the world. Laid across ridgelines. They exist because connection demanded were never between villages. Europe holds some of the most demanding road infrastructure ever built of the world. Laid across not because engineers miscalculated, but because the terrain left no other option. Isolated infrastructure ever built of the world. Laid across not because engineers miscalculated, but because the terrain left no other option. These roads follow the shape of the land. The land does not compromise. But what you are about to see is not performance. Follow the shape of geography. It is engineering under pressure. It is the physical reality of 25 routes that continue to move people and continue to test every driver who attempts them. Engineering under pressure. This is impossible places. 25 routes that continue to move people and continue to test every driver who attempts them. Engineering under D915 begins in Bayburt, a small provincial city in northeastern Turkey, and climbs without hesitation into the Pontic Mountains. D915 begins in Bayburt. The road covers approximately 170 kilometers before descending toward the Black Sea coast. For much of that distance, it moves through terrain that offers no flat ground, no gentle gradients, no room for indecision. For much of elevation along the highest section, terrain reaches over 2,300 meters. No gentle gradient, no room. The surface is asphalt, but the geometry is relentless, continuous switchbacks cut directly into steep mountain faces, with drops falling sharply on the outer edge, and bare rock pressing in from the other side. Switchbacks cut directly into no barrier faces, no shoulder, falling sharp. The road ends where the slope begins, and bare rock pressing in. In winter, ice forms without warning. In summer, the same curves dry into loose gravel near the edges, and trucks use this route regularly. In winter, moving goods between the interior plateau and the coastal ports. The same curves dry. The D915 was not built for scenery. Trucks was built because there was no other way through the interior plateau and the coastal ports. The same curves dry. The Zigana Pass sits at 2,030 meters above sea level, roughly 40 kilometers inland from the Black Sea coast in Transalpina province. The road through Zigana is part of the historic route connecting the Anatolian interior to the coastal lowlands from the Black Sea. For centuries, this corridor was the only viable passage through the Pontic Range. It's part of the historic modern asphalt follows much of that original alignment to the coastal lowlands from the Black Sea. The climb is dense, with vegetation on the lower slopes beach and further pressing close to the road edge. The modern asphalt higher up follows tree line thins alignment. The terrain opens. The climb is dense. At the summit, wind crosses the pass with little obstruction, pressing close to the road edge. Visibility here drops rapidly. The Black Sea's moisture system pushes inland through this corridor, and fog can reduce sight lines to under 20 meters within minutes. Temperature differentials between the coast and the plateau create conditions that change faster than forecasts can track, and fog can reduce sight lines. The road surface at the top carries significant freight traffic. Temperature around between the coast width is limited. Create conditions passing requires precision. Forecasts can track, and Zigana does not announce its difficulty at the top. It simply narrows the available space until attention becomes mandatory. Limited. Create conditions passing requires precision. Forecasts can track. The Kaçkar Mountains occupy the northeastern corner of Turkey, simply rising between the Black Sea coastline and the Georgian border. Mandatory. The roads through this range were not engineered for transit. They were made for access to villages built at altitudes where no Little other infrastructure reaches sea coastline and the Georgian. Some sections climb above 3,000 meters. Were not engineered for transit. The terrain here is raw. Villages, glacially carved valleys drop steeply on either side of narrow ridgelines, and the road surface shifts between asphalt, compacted gravel, and exposed rock, depending on altitude and season. Glacially carved valleys, snow remains on the upper passes until late June, and the road in October it returns between asphalt, compacted gravel. The isolation is structural, depending on altitude. Mobile signal disappears well below the highest sections, remains on the upper. Fuel stops do not exist above the valley floors. In October, a vehicle that stops moving here stays stopped until help arrives from below. Mobile signal. What makes the Kaçkar Road's distinction is not any single feature. Do not exist. It is the accumulation altitude, remoteness, surface variation, and seasonal unpredictability layered across every kilometer of the climb. What makes the Kaçkar Road the mountains is do not close. Feature. They simply become less forgiving with every meter gained. Surface variation and seasonal unpredictability are layered across Stelvio Pass sits at 2,758 meters above sea level in the Ortler Alps of northern Italy. It is the highest paved mountain pass in the Eastern Alps and the second highest in the entire continent. Stelvio Pass sits at 2,000. The road was completed in 1825, commissioned to connect the Austrian Empire's territories across terrain that had previously been impassable by wheeled vehicles, and the second highest in the entire. The numbers define it clearly. Sits at 48 numbered hairpin turns on the eastern ascent alone to connect the Austrian. A total climb of nearly 1,800 meters from the valley floor at Prato allo Stelvio, and the second highest in the entire. Each switchback is tight. Radius is minimal. Turns on the eastern ascent. The road surface is well maintained, but the geometry demands constant correction. From the valley floor, vehicles meet oncoming traffic on blind corners with less than 4 meters of switchback width between them. Radius is minimal. At the summit, the temperature drops sharply regardless of season. The wind crosses the exposed ridgeline with no terrain to slow it. Oncoming traffic on the surrounding peaks, with many permanently glaciated, frame a landscape with no visual shelter. At the summit, the temperature Stelvio is not obscure regardless of season. It is one of the most visited mountain passes in Europe, with no visibility does not reduce what the road asks of the people who drive it. Frame a landscape with no visual shelter. At the summit, Gavia Pass lies 30 kilometers southeast of Stelvio. It is one of connecting the Valtellina Valley to Valcamonica through the heart of the Lombardy Alps. It reaches 2,652 meters at its highest point, with no visual shelter. Where Stelvio is wide and well documented, 30 kilometers, Gavia is narrow and uncompromising. Valley to Valcamonica, the road was originally a military supply route, constructed during the First World War to move equipment across the Alpine front. That origin is still visible in the engineering functional direct. Gavia built for necessity rather than comfort. Valley to Valcamonica, with the road along the upper sections drops to under 3 meters, constructed during the First World War to move equipment. There are no barriers on the outer edge for significant stretches of the descent. Is still visible. The drop beside the road is not gradual. Gavia built for necessity. It falls away immediately. Snow closes Gavia for several months each year. Under 3 meters. The opening date varies. First World War. Some years the pass does not clear until late May. Significant stretches in heavy winters. Still later. Still, the road is not gradual. The surface carries meltwater through spring and early summer. Snow reducing traction on gradients that already demand careful throttle control. Varies. First World War. Some years Gavia receives a fraction of Stelvio's traffic. In heavy quietness does not make it easier. It makes the absence of assistance more measurable. And early summer. Snow reducing traction on gradients that most drivers who reach Stelvio summit road. Use the main eastern or western approach. Gavia receives a few continue onto the older variant that branches away from the primary route on the Italian side. It makes the absence. This alignment predates the modern road. Early summer. Sections of it follow the original 19th century construction style before engineers revised the geometry for heavier traffic. The surface here is rougher, that branches away. Main primes fade or disappear entirely on certain stretches. This alignment predates the modern road. Width narrows below 2.5 meters in the tightest section. Construction style. Before what distinguishes this variantry is its exposure. The modern Stelvio road is flanked by rock cuttings and retaining walls for much of its length. Entirely on the old variant sits more openly on the mountainside. Less engineered buffer between the road surface and the slope falling away beneath it. What distinguishes this variantry is at this altitude, wind moves across the road laterally by rock cutting. There is nothing on the upper section to redirect it. On the old variant sees limited maintenance compared to the main paths. Between surface degradation between seasons is visible frost heave, edge crumbling, loose material accumulating on the outer lane. Laterally by rock cutting, there is nothing disabled. It remains used, the old variant, but it asks for a different level of attention than the road it branches from. Between surface degradation between seasons is visible. Some roads are built to last, edge crumbling, others are built to survive, accumulating on the outer lane. The Transfăgărășan crosses the southern Carpathians in central Romania, connecting the historical regions of Wallachia and Transylvania across a mountain range that had no paved crossing for most of recorded history. Built to last, construction began in 1970 and was completed in 1974. The project required moving nearly 6 million kilograms of rock, using controlled detonations across the highest sections of the range, across a mountain range that had the road reaching 2,042 meters at its summit tunnel. Construction began below the tunnel on the northern side. The road descends through a sequence of tight switchbacks carved directly into the rock face. The gradient here sustains between 8 and 10% across several consecutive kilometers. The road reaches 2,000 guardrails exist along most of the route. Their condition varies. Below the tunnel on the northern side, the Transfăgărășan is opened only between late June and late October. Rock face. Snow arrives early at this elevation and closes the upper section before the calendar suggests winter has begun. The road reaches during the open season, traffic density increases sharply. Conditions vary. The road was not dimensioned for the volume it now carries. Passing opportunities are limited. Only between late patients is not optional. Rock face. Snow arrives early. What the road offers in visual scale, the reservoir and the bare ridge lines, the glacial cirques, it balances with consistent physical demands across every kilometer of its length. Sharply. Conditions vary. The road was not dimensioned for the volume. Transalpina runs along the highest ridgeline road in Romania, reaching 2,145 meters at its peak off the Hairpins mountain. The reservoir, it predates the Transfăgărășan by centuries. Sections of this route were used by Roman legions moving through the Carpathians. The road was not dimensioned. The modern surface was only fully paved in 2012. Ridgeline road in Romania, where Transfăgărășan descends dramatically through switchbacks. Transalpina moves differently. It follows the ridgeline itself for extended stretches, sections staying exposed at altitude rather than dropping away from it through the Carpathians. The road sits on the spine of the mountain. The surface was only fully paved in 20. On clear days, the terrain falls away on both sides, simultaneously valley floors, visible at over 1,000 meters below on the eastern and western flanks. It follows the ridgeline. There are sections where no elevated landmass exists out at the same height within the visible horizon through the Carpathians. The wind This exposure is constant and directional. Fully paved crosswind pressure on the upper ridge sections is measurable against the steering of any high-sided vehicles. Visible at over 1,000 meters, the road width is adequate for single-lane passing in most sections. At the narrowest points, it is not. Out at the same height, Transalpina carries less traffic than its more documented neighbor. That difference in visibility has not changed the road's physical character. The ridgeline remains what it always was, high-sided, elevated, and entirely without shelter. The road width is adequate for single-lane passing in most sections. DN10 connects the city of Brașov in central Romania to Buza on the southern plain, crossing the curvature Carpathians through the Stelvio Pass at approximately 1,100 meters. It is the least documented of Romania's three major mountain crossings. The road with that absence of attention is not accidental in most sections. The road does not offer the dramatic ridgeline exposure of Transalpina or the engineered spectacle of Transfăgărășan. Crossing the curvature, what it offers is sustained technical difficulty across a longer distance with fewer resources along the route. It is the least documented. Surface quality on 3N10 is inconsistent. The absence of sections of good asphalt give way to degraded stretches without warning. The dramatic ridgeline exposure of Tremola Reservoir all sits below the road on the eastern descent, a wide body of still water that creates its own localized weather. Fog forms over the surface and moves uphill toward the road in the early morning and late evening hours. Freight traffic uses this corridor regularly as an alternative to the busier mountain routes. The road width was not increased when freight volumes grew. All sits below the road. Passing a loaded truck on the narrower sections requires one vehicle to find a widening point and wait. Fog forms over the surface. DN10 rewards no particular quality in a driver, and it simply requires sustained attention across terrain that does not resolve into anything easier. Mountain routes. The road width was not increased when freight volumes grew. The Atlantic Ocean Road runs for 8.3 kilometers along the Norwegian coast between Averøy and Eide in Møre or Romsdal County. It was completed in 1989 after 8 years of construction interrupted repeatedly by severe weather that does not resolve into any. It crosses open sea. The road moves across a series of small islands and skerries connected by 8 bridge kilometers. Along the longest of these, Storsesundet Bridge, rises 23 meters above the water at its highest point, before descending at a gradient steep enough to obscure the continuation of the road from the driver's approach. Severe weather that does not resolve. From the summit of Storsesundet, the road ahead disappears. The road reappears on the other side and scary, but for a moment there is only water. Along the longest of these, the surrounding water is not sheltered. 23. The Norwegian Sea moves freely across this stretch of coastline, sending storm waves have reached the road surface and crossed it during severe weather events. The barriers along the outer edge are present, but not high. The road ahead disappears. Wind here is not occasional. The Atlantic coastline at this latitude receives some of the highest average wind speeds recorded on mainland Norway. 23. The Norwegian Sea. The road remains open year-round. It carries local traffic, freight, and a significant volume of visitors who arrive specifically to drive its length. The barriers along the outer edge are present. What they find is a structure built across open water, wind exposed on all sides of the ocean visible below the road surface on every crossing. Some of the highest average wind speeds recorded on mainland Norway. Helgelandskysten stretches along the Norwegian coastline between Steinkjer and Bodø, covering over 600 kilometers of coastal road through one of the most fragmented shorelines in Europe. What they find, this is not a single road across open water. It is a system on all sides of the ocean route moves across peninsulas, bridges, and ferry crossing. The highest threading between the mainland and an archipelago of over 18,000 islands, islets, and exposed rock formations. Steinkjer, the Seven Sisters mountain range, rises directly from the water on the eastern horizon. 7 distinct peaks between 910, 172 meters, uninterrupted by foothills. The system on all sides. The road surface varies significantly across its length and ferry crossing. Some sections are modern 2-lane highway archipelago, others narrow to a single lane with passing places marked at interval formations. Steinkjer, the 7 ferry crossings are integrated into the route. On the eastern horizon, missing a departure extends journey time by hours in the more remote section, 72 meters, uninterrupted. At this latitude, between 65 and 66 degrees north, varies. Daylight itself becomes less variable. Ferry crossing. In summer, light is continuous. Archipelago, in winter, functional daylight reduces to 4 hours or fewer. Steinkjer, the exposure here is horizontal rather than vertical. There are no great altitude changes. Journey time, the openness comes from water surrounding, constant, present on multiple sides for extended stretches of the route. 66 degrees north, distance absorbs attention differently than height. In summer, light is continuous. Scale is measured in hours. Functional daylight not meters to 4 hours or fewer. Senja is Norway's second largest island. Located in Troms County, approximately 250 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle. Water surrounds the scenic route along its western coast runs for 64 kilometers between Botnum and Grimsel. 6 degrees north. Distance, the island's western face rises abruptly from the sea. Light is continuous. Peaks along this coastline reach above 1,000 meters and descend almost directly into the fjords below, leaving a narrow corridor of habitable ground between the water and the rock. Approximately, the road occupies that corridor, sometimes widening across smaller coastal flats, more often pressing close against the base of the mountain wall. And several sections of the route are single-laned with designated passing bays from the sea. Light is continuous. The western exposure means weather arrives without warning and without gradual escalation directly into the precipitation, wind, and visibility change within the span of a single kilometer. Approximately the same stretch of road that sits in clear morning light can be inside low cloud within the hour. Often pressing close against the base. Snow remains on the upper slopes for most of the year. Several at road level, winter conditions persist from October through April. The western light at this latitude defines the visual character of the route more than any single geographic feature. In the weeks around midsummer, the sun does not set. The mountains and fjords remain fully illuminated through the night hours. The physical condition with no equivalent further south. Senja does not offer easy driving. It offers scale that has no middle distance. Persist from October through April. Trollstigen, or Trolls Pass, climbs the mountainside above Eikesdalsvegen Valley in Mura or Romsdal, rising 320 meters across 11 hairpins, some roads in under 9 kilometers. cut into rock faces made across ridges. It does not flatten between cornices. Margin for error. The road was opened in 1956 after 8 years of construction because workers cut the road by hand into a near vertical rock face, using the natural fracture line of the mountains to find a path where the terrain offered almost none. Each hairpin is numbered. Buses use this road here to calculate. Read that again. The width at the tightest corners is sufficient for a single vehicle. Coaches and larger vehicles require the full road surface to complete each turn oncoming traffic stops and waits at designated points while the maneuver is executed. We're about to see 2 waterfalls cross the road directly from geography. Stelvio Falls 180 meters from the plateau above, passing over the road surface on the upper section. In high melt season, every water crosses the asphalt continuously. This physical deposit on the road closes in winter. Continued snow and ice on the gradients of this area make the surface impassable for standard vehicles. A small financial city at the summit of the plateau opens sunrise without hesitation. Valley Fjord is 300 meters below. The 11 corners come as a single compressed structure against the rock. From above, the road looks like something placed there rather than built. It brings through terrain covered that offer no flat ground. The Lysebotn road descends from the Fjord plateau to the village of Lysebotn at the innermost point of the fjord, driving 620 meters across 27 hairpin turns in approximately 11 kilometers. Switchbacks, the fjord walls here are vertical faces. Lysebotn runs 39 kilometers inland from the Stavanger coast. Rock faces rising straight from the water to heights exceeding 1,000 meters on both sides. The road occupies a narrow fault line next to the wall, the only point along the stretch where the cliff face allows any descent at all. Each hairpin turn is blasted into the rock in moving secular tunnel material. The outer edge of the road, the higher sections, sits above a drop that falls directly to the fjord surface, 600 meters below, because there is no intermediate terrain. The ground simply ends at the road edge and resumes water level. Width is limited to a single lane across the majority of the descent. At the base, Lysebotn receives no road access from any other direction. The only alternatives are boat or helicopter. Because this part of the community that lives there, this road is not a single route. The modern asphalt, it is the only way out. Eikesdalsvegen run along the eastern shore of Lake Eikesdalsvegen in Furka, connecting the small community of Eikesdalen to the broader road network of Eikesdalsvegen. Crosses the Maas. The lake is 4 kilometers long and sits at 66 meters above sea level. The mountains surrounding it rise directly from the water to heights above 1,420 meters. The road occupies the only available ground between the lake surface and the rock face. In places, that ground is less than 6 meters wide, carries significant freight traffic. The valley receives limited direct sunlight through the winter months, passing over surrounding peaks that are high enough and close enough to block the lonely solar and the rocky tile. From November through February, the road operates in shadow for most of the day, passing from avalanche risk is documented along several sections. Protective structures, concrete galleries, and earth barriers cover parts of the route. The slope above is steep, where gallery's end, the exposure is enormous. Altitude. The road is not heavily trafficked. The community is served some small but the physical conditions it operates under compression between water and rock, avalanche exposure, restricted light, limited existing currents of traffic, and the road surface shifts. Eikesdalsvegen does not demand speed or altitude. It demands awareness of how little space exists between the infrastructure and the forces surrounding The Furka Pass connects the canton of Uri and Valais in the central Swiss Alps, reaching 2,429 meters at its summit. It sits between two of Switzerland's significant mountain massifs, the Gotthard Group to the south and the Bonette Alps to the north. The road over Furka has existed in some form since the medieval period. The current paved alignment was established in the early 20th century. The upper sections move across open alpine terrain. Minimal vegetation makes the above 2,000 meters. The landscape reduces to rock, thin soil, and residual snowfields that persist through summer on the north-facing slopes. Nothing interrupts the view at 2,400 meters. There is nothing left to interrupt the Alps. The Rhone Glacier sits directly adjacent to the road on the western approach. At the beginning of the 20th century, the glacier extended to the road edge, painting it no longer does. The recession is measurable through the increased Gavia, and the exposed rock where ice once sat is clearly visible from the road surface, helping to find the terrain. The pass closes in winter, typically from October through June. The closure period is longer than most Swiss passes at comparable altitude due to the sustained exposure of the summit plateau. Furka carries a particular kind of stillness at altitude, not absence of activity, visible result of forces operating at a scale and duration the road infrastructure isn't passing through. High corners less than 4 Grimsel Pass lies 12 kilometers southeast of Furka, connecting the Hairpins Valley in the canton of Uri to Gom in Valais. Its summit reaches 2,164 meters lower than Furka. The surrounding terrain is wider and more open. The two passes share a plateau, and drivers crossing both in sequence spend an extended period above 2,000 meters. Grimsel's approach from the north rises through a series of reservoir lakes built up the granite basin below the summit. The Grimsel and Explorency reservoirs sit at over 1,900 meters, their surfaces reflecting the bare rock walls surrounding them. The road moves along the reservoir edges for several kilometers wide before the final climb. Gavia is narrow, the water defines this pass more than any other feature. The upper road surface is exposed to 3-4 cycles across a long shoulder line. Edge deterioration is visible on several functions. The guardrails along the reservoir sections are functional but not continuous. Mobility, which arrives quickly at this altitude, the distinction between road surface, reservoir edge, and open drops become difficult to read from inside a vehicle. Grimsel closes in winter alongside Furka. The two passes form a connected system that effectively isolates the upper valley from the north for several months each year until late winter. The road does not resist that isolation. It simply marks the possible season end of spring and summer, producing traction on the month. The Tremola is the old road of the Gotthard Pass, the original cobblestone alignment that carried traffic across the Central Alps before the modern route built alongside it. It climbs from Airolo in the canton of Ticino to the pass summit creating continuous low-frequency vibration through any vehicle that travels them. Construction behaves differently here than on asphalt, particularly in wet conditions. The stone surface offers significantly less grip than a driver accustomed to modern roads would expect. Stretches 38 hairpin turns connect the valley floor to the summit, tightest section. The gradient of Tremola averages 10%. Several corners tighten beyond what modern road geometry would admit. At the outer edge of the upper section is defined by low stone walls, original construction mounting not safety barriers, but current engineering sets. And the construction for Gotthard Pass has been a transit point for over 7 centuries. Armies, merchants, and pilgrims use this corridor with an unpaved track across the mountain. The Cobblestone road formalized that passage. The Tremola is now a protected historic monument. It remains open to traffic and use material. It moves at the pace the surface demands, which is slower than almost any other road in this sequence. Protection for the Alps end. The exposure does not zero. Col de la Bonette sits in the Alpine Maritime department of southern France, on the border between Tour Massif and the Ridgeline Valley. The road reaches 2,802 meters at the summit, making it the highest paved road in the Alps. Crossing the final approach encircles the peak entirely. Construction began in 1970. The loop road added above the pass proper was constructed to allow the route to claim its altitude less. It serves no transit function. It exists purely to gain those final meters of elevation before descending back to the pass below 1,042 meters and it's above 2,600 meters. Construction vegetation disappears entirely. The road descends through a terrain at the summit which is screened and exposed bedrock. No trees, no shrubs, no surface features to interrupt the wind across the surrounding ridgeline offers no shelter in any direction. On clear days, visibility extends across 4 departments and into Italy. The Transfăgărășan road serves only underneath carriers. The outer edge drops away into a wide open valley. No cliff from a sustained gradient falling several hundred meters has nothing to arrest the vehicle to traffic road. Increasing sharp. Col de la Bonette closes from November through June. The snow depth at the summit regularly exceeds 4 meters during winter. At this elevation, the air pressure is immeasurably lower. Engine performance increases. Braking distances increase kilometers. The numbers are not metaphor. They are operating conditions. Along the highest Col de Galibier connects the Bonette Valley in Savoie to the Brian Summit in south, reaching 2,642 meters at its summit. It sits between two of the most significant alpine masses in France, the Hairpins to the south and the Valois to the north. The road exists in 2 parts. The northern approach from Senja to Moria climbs through the Col de Telegraph. First, a separate pass at 1,566 meters before descending briefly and near Assault proper. The driver approaching from the north crosses 2 passes to reach the south side. Simultaneously, the upper road narrows significantly above 2,400 meters. The summit tunnel cut through the mountains just below the highest point offers an alternative to the exposed final climb. The tunnel is unlit direction. The road surface inside is uneven. Most drivers who know the route take the open road above the wind and is channeled by the surrounding peaks into a persistent westerly flow. It arrives laterally across the road surface, enough force to affect vehicle stability and lower driving speed. Not changed, the descent toward Grimsel covers 30 kilometers of sustained gradient. Brake temperature entirely a measurable concern on the lower sections. Galibier closes in winter. Every spring it opens again and the cyclists arrive before the snow has fully cleared across the curvature country. The road was not built for this, and it does not adjust for them either. The Col de Turini rises to 1,607 meters in the Alpes Maritimes, northeast of Nice, connecting the valleys of the Vesuvius and the Hairpins through the heart of the Mercantour Massif of Transfăgărășan. It is the lowest summit in the sequence. Technically, the difficulty across altitude and fewer resources along the road through Turini is defined by its geometry, continuous tight corners through dense forest, limited sight lines, and a surface that carries moisture in the surrounding tree canopy long after rain has stopped. The asphalt remains down in the shadow of the hours. In winter, that moisture freezes without the surface showing back ice. The corners do not telegraph their radius from the approach. Turini is inseparable from the Monte Carlo Rally, which has used these roads since 1911. The night stages through this pass are among the most technically demanding for international motorsport, not because of speed, but because the surface, the shadows, and the corner geometry combine in ways that remove predictability entirely. At competition speeds, the road offers almost no margin. Across abnormal speeds, it still asks for complete attention across every corner. The forest perseveres on both sides, and visibility beyond the next bend is rarely more than 40 meters. After the descent towards Sosport tightens further on the lower section, where the road was cut into the hillside after being room for widening. Interrupted Turini finishes by saying the valley floor finally arrives. Not a moment before. The road cuts across the Combe-Laval Road cuts into the western face to Ridgeline Plateau along the Turini department to the southeastern France. 23 was constructed between 1901 and 1907 to connect the isolated mountains of the plateau interior to the valley below at Senja and Norway. From the summit across the road does not switch back down the slope, it traverses it. For approximately 10 kilometers, the route moves horizontally across a near vertical limestone cliff face, carved directly into the rock at a consistent altitude. The cliff above rises another 200 meters. Below the road edge, the drop falls to 300 to 400 meters to the valley floor. There is no graduated slope. The cliff is essentially vertical. The road does not acknowledge this. It simply continues. The road averages between 4 and 5 meters. A low stone parapet runs along the outer edge for much of the route's original construction, not the modern safety barrier. In several sections, it is absent entirely. Passing two vehicles requires one to find a widening point. On the cliff face section, those points are scarce. The limestone wall on the inner side seeps water continuously through wet seasons. The road surface carries that moisture out toward the edge. Combe-Laval is built to move timber. The logs came down from the plateau on a cable system that still exists in partial form above the road. The cliff did not change from the logging start. at its summit, the highest road pass in Slovenia. The road was built by Russian prisoners of war during the First World War. Between 1915 and 1917, approximately 10,000 Russian prisoners constructed the route under Austro-Hungarian military command to supply the Izonzo front. The conditions were severe. An avalanche in 1916 killed over 300 workers in a single event. A small wooden chapel built by the survivors still stands beside the road through the summit. 50 winding turns connect the valley floors on both sides. The northern approach carries 24 numbered hairpins across a sustained gradient through dense pine forest. The southern descent drops more steeply through open terrain toward the Socha River, which runs a distinctive glacial turquoise far below the road on the final kilometers of descent. The road surface on the upper sections is cobblestone original construction, preserved and partly replaced. Traction in wet conditions behaves differently than on asphalt, particularly through the tighter corners. Width is limited. Coaches navigate the pass but require the full road surface on each hairpin. Travershich carries its history in the material of the road itself. The cobblestones, the chapel, the numbered corners, none of it has been removed or modernized beyond necessity. The pass remembers what it cost to build. Grossglockner High Alpine Road runs 48 kilometers through the Hohe-Tauern range in the Austrian Alps, connecting Rock in Salzburg province to Heidelberg in Carinthia. It reaches its highest point at 2,504 meters on the Hoctor Pass. It is the longest high alpine road in Austria. It was also entirely engineered for purpose. Construction ran from 1938 to 1935, employing over 3,000 workers during the height of the economic depression. The road was designed from the beginning as a tourist route wider than military or freight roads of the period. Using platforms, infrastructure, and a secondary spur, road climbing to 2,600 meters at the Edelweiss Spitze. The main road is well maintained, and maintenance is continuous and expensive. At this altitude, frost damage accumulates across every meter. The road surface requires systematic renewal each spring before opening. The season runs from May to November. Outside those months, snow depth and avalanche risk make the route impassable. Grossglockner itself, Austria's highest peak, at 3,798 meters, is visible from multiple points along the road. The Pastors Glacier, the longest of the Eastern Alps, lies directly below the summit and is visible from the Franz Josefs Hierarchy platform on the eastern spur. The glacier has retreated over 3 kilometers since measurements began. The road observes that procession from a fixed position, season after season, without moving. The Amalfi Coast Road Strada Statale 163 runs approximately 50 kilometers along the southern edge of the Sorrento Peninsula in Campania, connecting Positano to Vietri sul Mare above the Tyrrhenian Sea. It was carved into a cliff face in the early 19th century. Before it existed, the coastal villages had no land connection to each other. The road is narrow. In most sections, it carries 2 lanes of traffic across a total width that many inland roads would consider a single lane. On one side, the cliff rises sharply. On the The drop to the sea ranges between 30 and 200 meters, depending on location. But there is no shoulder. There is no margin. Bus routes operate along this road daily. Delivery vehicles use it. Local residents drive it at speed built from familiarity. Visitors arrive without that familiarity and meet oncoming traffic on blind corners above open water. The geometry does not accommodate hesitation. In summer, traffic density increases to a level the road is never dimensioned to carry. Passing requires one vehicle to reverse to the nearest widening point, sometimes 100 meters or more behind. The sea below is consistently visible. It does not recede as elevation changes. It simply remains present blue, immediate, and several hundred meters below the outer rim. Amalfi is not remote. It is not extreme by altitude. What it offers is sustained proximity to consequence across every kilometer of its length. The road ends where the peninsula does. Not because it was designed to finish there, because the land ran out. 25 roads. Across 8 countries. Across terrain that resisted every attempt to cross it until necessity made crossing unavoidable. What connects them is not danger as spectacle. It is a visible relationship between human infrastructure and physical reality. The places where engineers measured what the land offered and built within those measurements, precisely and without excess. These roads exist because isolation has a cost that eventually becomes higher than the cost of construction. They remain because the terrain has not changed. The gradients, the exposure, the altitude, the weather, none of it has been resolved. It has only been addressed. Every driver who uses these roads enters that address directly. This is Hazard Atlas. This is Impossible Places. There are more roads, more passes, more coastlines cut into rock above water that offers no margin for error. If this sequence held your attention, the next one is already being mapped. And a heart captures your attention by ancient Some roads were never meant to be easy. They were cut into rock faces, laid across ridgelines, suspended above valleys with no margin for error. They exist because connection demanded it between villages, between nations, between isolated communities, and the rest of the world. Europe holds some of the most demanding road infrastructure ever built. Not because engineers miscalculated, but because the terrain left no other option. These roads follow the shape of the land. The land does not compromise. What you are about to see is not performance. It is geography. It is engineering under pressure. It is the physical reality of 25 routes that continue to move people and continue to test every driver who attempts them. This is Impossible Places. The land tests everything's like the surface of another planet. The D915 begins in Bayburt, a small provincial city in northeastern Turkey, and climbs without hesitation into the Pontic Mountains. The road covers approximately 170 kilometers before descending toward the Black Sea coast. For much of that distance, it moves through terrain that offers no flat ground, no gentle gradient, no room for indecision. Elevation along the highest sections reaches over 2,300 meters. The surface is asphalt, but the geometry is relentless continuous switchbacks cut directly into steep mountain faces, with drops falling sharply on the outer edge and bare rock pressing in from the other side. No barrier, no shoulder. The road ends where the slope begins. In winter, ice forms without warning. In summer, the same curves dry into loose gravel near the edges. Trucks use this route regularly, moving goods between the interior plateau and the coastal ports. The D915 was not built for scenery. It was built because there was no other way through. Zigana Pass sits at 2,030 meters above sea level, roughly 40 kilometers inland from the Black Sea coast in Trabzon province. The road through Zigana is part of the historic route connecting the Anatolian interior to the coastal lowlands. For centuries, this corridor was the only viable passage through the Pontic Range. The modern asphalt follows much of that original alignment. The climb is dense, with vegetation on the lower slopes beach and fir pressing close to the road edge. Higher up, the tree line thins. The terrain opens. At the summit, wind crosses the pass with little obstruction. Visibility here drops rapidly. The Black Sea's moisture system pushes inland through this corridor, and fog can reduce sight lines to under 20 meters within minutes. Temperature differentials between the coast and the plateau create conditions that change faster than forecasts can track. The road surface at the top carries significant freight traffic year-round. Width is limited. Passing requires precision. Zigana does not announce its difficulty. It simply narrows the available space until attention becomes mandatory. The Kaçkar Mountains occupy the northeastern corner of Turkey, rising between the Black Sea coastline and the Georgian border. The roads through this range were not engineered for transit. They were made for access to villages built at altitudes where no other infrastructure reaches. Some sections climb above 3,000 meters. The terrain here is raw. Glacially carved valleys drop steeply on either side of narrow ridgelines. The road surface shifts between asphalt, compacted gravel, and exposed rock, depending on altitude and season. Snow remains on the upper passes until late June. In October, it returns. The isolation is structural. Mobile signal disappears well below the highest sections. Fuel stops do not exist above the valley floors. A vehicle that stops moving here stays stopped until help arrives from below. What makes the Kaçkar roads distinct is not any single feature. It is the accumulation altitude, remoteness, surface variation, and seasonal unpredictability layered across every kilometer of the climb. The mountains do not close. They simply become less forgiving with every meter gained. Stelvio Pass sits at 2,758 meters above sea level in the Ortler Alps of northern Italy. It is the highest paved mountain pass in the Eastern Alps and the second highest in the entire continent. The road was completed in 1825, commissioned to connect the Austrian Empire's territories across terrain that had previously been impassable by wheeled vehicles. The numbers define it clearly. 48 numbered hairpin turns on the eastern ascent alone. A total climb of nearly 1,800 meters from the valley floor at Prato allo Stelvio. Each switchback is tight. Radius is minimal. The road surface is well maintained, but the geometry demands constant correction. Vehicles meet oncoming traffic on blind corners with less than 4 meters of usable width between them. At the summit, the temperature drops sharply regardless of season. Wind crosses the exposed ridgeline with no terrain to slow it. The surrounding peaks, many permanently glaciated, frame a landscape with no visual shelter. Stelvio is not obscure. It is one of the most visited mountain passes in Europe. That visibility does not reduce what the road asks of the people who drive it. Gavia Pass lies 30 kilometers southeast of Stelvio, connecting the Valtellina Valley to Val Camonica through the heart of the Lombardy Alps. It reaches 2,652 meters at its highest point. Where Stelvio is wide and well documented, Gavia is narrow and uncompromising. The road was originally a military supply route, constructed during the First World War to move equipment across the Alpine front. That origin is still visible in the engineering functional, direct, built for necessity rather than comfort. Width along the upper sections drops to under 3 meters in places. There are no barriers on the outer edge for significant stretches of the descent. The drop beside the road is not gradual. It falls away immediately. Snow closes Gavia for several months each year. The opening date varies. Some years the pass does not clear until late May. In heavy winters, later still. The surface carries meltwater through spring and early summer, reducing traction on gradients that already demand careful throttle control. Gavia receives a fraction of Stelvio's traffic. That quietness does not make it easier. It makes the absence of assistance more measurable. Most drivers who reach Stelvio summit use the main eastern or western approach. Few continue onto the older variant that branches away from the primary route on the Italian side. This alignment predates the modern road. Sections of it follow the original 19th century construction path before engineers revised the geometry for heavier traffic. The surface here is rougher. Lane markings fade or disappear entirely on certain stretches. Width narrows below 2.5 meters in the tightest sections. What distinguishes this variant is its exposure. The modern Stelvio road is flanked by rock cuttings and retaining walls for much of its length. The old variant sits more openly on the mountainside, less engineered buffer between the road surface and the slope falling away beneath it. At this altitude, wind moves across the road laterally. There is nothing on the upper sections to redirect it. The variant sees limited maintenance compared to the main pass. Surface degradation between seasons is visible frost heave, edge crumbling, loose material accumulating on the outer lane. It remained passable. It remains used. But it asks for a different level of attention than the road it branches from. Some roads are built to last. Others are built to survive. The Transfăgărășan crosses the southern Carpathians in central Romania, connecting the historical regions of Wallachia and Transylvania across a mountain range that had no paved crossing for most of recorded history. Construction began in 1970 and was completed in 1974. The project required moving nearly 6 million kilograms of rock using controlled detonations across the highest sections of the range. The road reaches 2,042 meters at its summit tunnel. Below the tunnel on the northern side, the road descends through a sequence of tight switchbacks carved directly into the rock face. The gradient here sustains between 8 and 10% across several consecutive kilometers. Guardrails exist along most of the route. Their condition varies. The Transfăgărășan is open only between late June and late October. Snow arrives early at this elevation and closes the upper sections before the calendar suggests winter has begun. During the open season, traffic density increases sharply. The road was not dimensioned for the volume it now carries. Passing opportunities are limited. Patience is not optional. What the road offers in visual scale, the reservoir, the bare ridgeline, the glacial cirques, it balances with consistent physical demand across every kilometer of its length. Transalpina runs along the highest ridgeline road in Romania, reaching 2,145 meters at its peak near Papusa Mountain. It predates the Transfăgărășan by centuries. Sections of this route were used by Roman legions moving through the Carpathians. The modern surface was only fully paved in 2012. Where Transfăgărășan descends dramatically through switchbacks, Transalpina moves differently. It follows the ridgeline itself for extended stretches, staying exposed at altitude rather than dropping away from it. The road sits on the spine of the mountains. On clear days, the terrain falls away on both sides, simultaneously valley floors, visible at over 1,000 meters below on the eastern and western flanks. There are sections where no elevated landmass exists at the same height within the visible horizon. Wind at this exposure is constant and directional. Crosswind pressure on the upper ridge sections is measurable against the steering of any high-sided vehicle. The road width is adequate for single-lane passing in most sections. At the narrowest points, it is not. Transalpina carries less traffic than its more documented neighbor. That difference in visibility has not changed the road's physical character. The ridgeline remains what it always was: open, elevated, and entirely without shelter. DN10 connects the city of Brașov in central Romania to Buzău on the southern plain, crossing the curvature Carpathians through the Stelvio Pass at approximately 1,100 meters. It is the least documented of Romania's 3 major mountain crossings. That absence of attention is not accidental. The road does not offer the dramatic ridgeline exposure of Transalpina or the engineered spectacle of Transfăgărășan. What it offers is sustained technical difficulty across a longer distance with fewer resources along the route. Surface quality on DN10 is inconsistent. Sections of good asphalt give way to degraded stretches without warning. The Siriu Reservoir sits below the road on the eastern descent, a wide body of still water that creates its own localized weather. Fog forms over the surface and moves uphill toward the road in the early morning and late evening hours. Freight traffic uses this corridor regularly as an alternative to the busier mountain routes. The road width was not increased when freight volumes grew. Passing a loaded truck on the narrower sections requires one vehicle to find a widening point and wait. DN10 rewards no particular quality in a driver. It simply requires sustained attention across terrain that does not resolve into anything easier. The Atlantic Ocean Road runs for 8.3 kilometers along the Norwegian coast between Averøy and Eide in Møre og Romsdal County. It was completed in 1989 after 8 years of construction interrupted repeatedly by severe weather. It crosses open sea. The road moves across a series of small islands and skerries connected by 8 bridges. The longest of these, Storsøysundet Bridge, rises 23 meters above the water at its highest point, before descending at a gradient steep enough to obscure the continuation of the road from the driver's approach. From the summit of Storsøysundet, the road ahead disappears. It reappears on the other side, but for a moment there is only water. The surrounding water is not sheltered. The Norwegian Sea moves freely across this stretch of coastline. Storm waves have reached the road surface and crossed it during severe weather events. The barriers along the outer edge are present, but not high. Wind here is not occasional. The Atlantic coastline at this latitude receives some of the highest average wind speeds recorded on mainland Norway. The road remains open year-round. It carries local traffic, freight, and a significant volume of visitors who arrive specifically to drive its length. What they find is a structure built across open water, exposed on all sides, with the ocean visible below the road surface on every crossing. Helgelandskysten stretches along the Norwegian coastline between Steinkjer and Bodø, covering over 600 kilometers of coastal road through one of the most fragmented shorelines in Europe. This is not a single road. It is a system. The route moves across peninsulas, bridges, and ferry crossings, threading between the mainland and an archipelago of over 18,000 islands, islets, and exposed rock formations. The Seven Sisters mountain range rises directly from the water on the eastern horizon. 7 distinct peaks between 910, 100, and 72 meters, uninterrupted by foothills. The road surface varies significantly across its length. Some sections are modern 2-lane highway. Others narrow to a single lane, with passing places marked at intervals. Ferry crossings are integrated into the route. Missing a departure extends journey time by hours in the more remote sections. At this latitude, between 65 and 66 degrees north, daylight itself becomes a variable. In summer, light is continuous. In winter, functional daylight reduces to 4 hours or fewer. The exposure here is horizontal rather than vertical. There are no great altitude changes. The openness comes from water surrounding, constant, present on multiple sides for extended stretches of the route. Distance absorbs attention differently than height. Here, scale is measured in hours, not meters. Senja is Norway's second largest island, located in Troms County, approximately 250 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle. The scenic route along its western coast runs for 64 kilometers between Botnum and Grillfjord. The island's western face rises abruptly from the sea. Peaks along this coastline reach above 1,000 meters and descend almost directly into the fjords below, leaving a narrow corridor of habitable ground between the water and the rock. The road occupies that corridor, sometimes widening across small coastal flats, more often pressing close against the base of the mountain wall. Several sections of the route are single lane with designated passing bays. The western exposure means weather arrives without warning and without gradual escalation. Precipitation, wind, and visibility change within the span of a single kilometer. The same stretch of road that sits in clear morning light can be inside low cloud within the hour. Snow remains on the upper slopes for most of the year. At road level, winter conditions persist from October through April. The light at this latitude defines the visual character of the route more than any single geographic feature. In the weeks around midsummer, the sun does not set. The mountains and fjords remain fully illuminated through the night hours, a physical condition with no equivalent further south. Senja does not offer easy driving. It offers scale that has no middle distance. Trollstigen, the Troll's Path, climbs the mountainside above Eikesdalsvegen Valley in Mura or Romsdal, rising 320 meters across 11 hairpin turns in under 9 kilometers. The gradient averages 9%. It does not flatten between corners. The road was opened in 1936 after 8 years of construction. Workers cut the route by hand into a near vertical rock face, using the natural fracture lines of the mountain to find a path where the terrain offered almost none. Each hairpin is numbered. Buses use this road. Read that again. The width at the tightest corners is sufficient for a single vehicle. Coaches and larger vehicles require the full road surface to complete each turn oncoming traffic stops and waits at designated points while the maneuver is executed. 2 waterfalls cross the road directly. Stigfossen falls 180 meters from the plateau above, passing over the road surface on the upper section. In high melt season, water crosses the asphalt continuously. The road closes in winter. Snow and ice on gradients of this angle make the surface impassable for standard vehicles. At the summit, the plateau opens suddenly. The valley floor is 300 meters below. The 11 corners are visible as a single compressed structure against the rock. From above, the road looks like something placed there rather than built. Lysebotn Road descends from the Lysefjord plateau to the village of Lysebotn at the innermost point of the fjord, dropping 620 meters across 27 hairpin turns in approximately 11 kilometers. The fjord walls here are vertical. Lysefjord runs 39 kilometers inland from the Stavanger coast, with rock faces rising straight from the water to heights exceeding 1,000 meters on both sides. The road occupies a narrow fault line in the eastern wall, the only point along this stretch where the cliff face allows any descent at all. Each hairpin turn is blasted into the rock. Several are tunneled. The outer edge of the road at the highest sections sits above a drop that falls directly to the fjord surface, 600 meters below. There is no intermediate terrain, no slope. The ground simply ends at the road edge and resumes at water level. Width is limited to a single lane across the majority of the descent. At the base, Lysebotn receives no road access from any other direction. The only alternatives are boat or helicopter. For the community that lives there, this road is not a scenic route. It is the only way out. Eikesdalsvegen runs along the eastern shore of Lake Eikesdalsvegen in Møre og Romsdal, connecting the small community of Eikesdalen to the broader road network at Eidsvåg. The lake is 4 kilometers long and sits at 66 meters above sea level. The mountains surrounding it rise directly from the water to heights above 1,400 meters. The road occupies the only available ground between the lake surface and the rock wall. In places, that ground is less than 6 meters wide. The valley receives limited direct sunlight through the winter months. The surrounding peaks are high enough and close enough to block the low solar angle entirely. From November through February, the road operates in shadow for most of the day. Avalanche risk is documented along several sections. Protective structures, concrete galleries, and earth barriers cover parts of the route where the slope above is steepest. Where galleries end, the exposure resumes. The road is not heavily trafficked. The community it serves is small, but the physical conditions it operates under compression between water and rock, avalanche exposure, restricted light, limited width exist regardless of traffic volume. Eikesdalsvegen does not demand speed or altitude. It demands awareness of how little space exists between the infrastructure and the forces surrounding it. Furka Pass connects the cantons of Uri and Valais in the central Swiss Alps, reaching 2,429 meters at its summit. It sits between two of Switzerland's most significant mountain massifs, the Gotthard Group to the south and the Bernese Alps to the north. The road over Furka has existed in some form since the medieval period. The current paved alignment was established in the early 20th century. The upper sections move across open alpine terrain with minimal vegetation. Above 2,000 meters, the landscape reduces to rock, thin soil, and residual snowfields that persist through summer on the north-facing slopes. Nothing interrupts the wind here. At 2,400 meters, there is nothing left to interrupt. The Rhone Glacier sits directly adjacent to the road on the western approach. At the beginning of the 20th century, the glacier extended to the road edge. It no longer does. The recession is measurable in meters per year, and the exposed rock where ice once sat is clearly visible from the road surface. The pass closes in winter, typically from October through June. The closure period is longer than most Swiss passes at comparable altitude due to the sustained exposure of the summit plateau. Furka carries a particular kind of stillness at altitude, not absence of activity, but the visible result of forces operating at a scale and duration that road infrastructure simply passes through. Grimsel Pass lies 12 kilometers southeast of Furka, connecting the Haslitl Valley in the canton of Bern to Goms in Valais. Its summit reaches 2,164 meters lower than Furka, but the surrounding terrain is wider and more open. The two passes share a plateau. Drivers crossing both in sequence spend an extended period above 2,000 meters. Grimsel's approach from the north rises through a series of reservoir lakes built into the granite basin below the summit. The Grimsel and Retterikspodensee reservoirs sit at over 1,900 meters, their surfaces reflecting the bare rock walls surrounding them. The road moves along the reservoir edges for several kilometers before the final climb. Water defines this pass more than any other feature. The upper road surface is exposed to freeze-thaw cycles across a long shoulder season. Edge deterioration is visible on several outer corners. The guardrails along the reservoir sections are functional but not continuous. In poor visibility, which arrives quickly at this altitude, the distinction between road surface, reservoir edge, and open drop becomes difficult to read from inside a vehicle. Grimsel closes in winter alongside Furka. The two passes form a connected system that effectively isolates the upper Valais from the north for several months each year. The road does not resist that isolation. It simply marks where the passable season ends. The Tremola is the old road over Gotthard Pass, the original cobblestone alignment that carried traffic across the Central Alps before the modern route was built alongside it. It climbs from Airolo in the canton of Ticino to the pass summit at 2,091 meters. The cobblestones are original. Many were laid in the 19th century. The road surface is not smooth. The rounded stones create a continuous, low-frequency vibration through any vehicle that travels them. Traction behaves differently here than on asphalt, particularly in wet conditions, where the stone surface offers significantly less grip than a driver accustomed to modern roads will expect. 38 hairpin turns connect the valley floor to the summit. The gradient on the Tremola averages 10%. Several corners tighten beyond what modern road geometry would permit. The outer edge on the upper section is defined by low stone walls, original construction, not safety barriers in any current engineering sense. Gotthard Pass has been a transit point for over 7 centuries. Armies, merchants, and pilgrims used this corridor when it was an unpaved track across the mountain. The cobblestone road formalized that passage. The Tremola is now a protected historic monument. It remains open to traffic. It moves at the pace the surface demands, which is slower than almost any other road in this sequence. The Alps end. The exposure does not. Col de la Bonette sits in the Alpes-Maritimes department of southern France, on the border between the Mercantour Massif and the Ubaye Valley. The road reaches 2,802 meters at the summit loop, making it the highest paved road in the Alps. The final approach circles the peak entirely. The loop road added above the pass proper was constructed to allow the route to claim its altitude record. It serves no transit function. It exists purely to gain those final meters of elevation before descending back to the pass below. Above 2,600 meters, vegetation disappears entirely. The terrain at the summit is scree and exposed bedrock. No trees, no shrubs, no surface features to interrupt the wind. The surrounding ridgeline offers no shelter in any direction. On clear days, visibility extends across 4 departements and into Italy. The road surface on the upper loop narrows. The outer edge drops away into a wide open bowl, no immediate cliff, but a sustained gradient falling several hundred meters with nothing to arrest a vehicle that leaves the road. Col de la Bonette closes from November through June. The snow depth at the summit regularly exceeds 4 meters during winter. At this elevation, the air pressure is measurably lower. Engine performance decreases. Braking distances increase. The numbers are not metaphor. They are operating conditions. Col du Galibier connects the Maurienne Valley in Savoie to the Briançonnet in Hautes-Alpes, reaching 2,642 metres at its summit. It sits between 2 of the most significant alpine massifs in France, the Écrins to the south and the Vanoise to the north. The road exists in 2 halves. The northern approach from Saint-Michel-de-Maurienne climbs through the Col du Télégraphe, first a separate pass at 1,566 meters before descending briefly and beginning the Galibier ascent proper. A driver approaching from the north crosses 2 passes to reach the summit. The upper road narrows significantly above 2,400 meters. The summit tunnel, cut through the mountain just below the highest point, offers an alternative to the exposed final climb. The tunnel is unlit. The road surface inside is uneven. Most drivers who know the route take the open road above it instead. Wind at the Galibier summit is channeled by the surrounding peaks into a persistent westerly flow. It arrives laterally across the road surface with enough force to affect vehicle stability at normal driving speeds. The descent toward Briançon covers 30 kilometers of sustained gradient. Brake temperature becomes a measurable concern on the lower sections. Galibier closes in winter. Every spring, it opens again, and the cyclists arrive before the snow has fully cleared. The road was not built for them. It does not adjust for them either. Col de Turini rises to 1,607 meters in the Alpes-Maritimes, northeast of Nice, connecting the valleys of the Vesubie and the Bévérat through the heart of the Mercantour Massif. It is the lowest summit in this sequence. The difficulty is not altitude. The road through Turini is defined by its geometry, continuous tight corners through dense forest, with limited sight lines and a surface that carries moisture from the surrounding tree canopy long after rain has stopped. The asphalt remains damp in shadow for hours. In winter, that moisture freezes without the surface showing visible ice. The corners do not telegraph their radius from the approach. Turini is inseparable from the Monte Carlo Rally, which has used these roads since 1911. The night stages through this pass are among the most technically demanding in international motorsport, not because of speed, but because the surface, the shadows, and the corner geometry combine in ways that remove predictability entirely. At competition speeds, the road offers almost no margin. At normal speeds, it still asks for complete attention across every corner. The forest presses in from both sides. Visibility beyond the next bend is rarely more than 40 meters. The descent towards Sospel tightens further on the lower section, where the road was cut into the hillside with no room for widening. Turini finishes where the valley floor finally arrives. Not a moment before. Combe-Laval Road cuts into the western face of the Vercors Plateau in the Drôme department of southeastern France. It was constructed between 1901 and 1907 to connect the isolated logging communities of the plateau interior to the valley below at Saint-Jean-en-Royans. The road does not switch back down the slope, it traverses it. For approximately 10 kilometers, the route moves horizontally across a near vertical limestone cliff face, carved directly into the rock at a consistent altitude. The cliff above rises another 200 meters. Below the road edge, the drop falls between 300 and 400 meters to the valley floor. There is no graduated slope. The cliff is essentially vertical. The road does not acknowledge this. It simply continues. The road width averages between 4 and 5 meters. A low stone parapet runs along the outer edge for much of the route original construction, not modern safety barrier. In several sections, it is absent entirely. Passing two vehicles requires one to find a widening point. On the cliff face sections, those points are scarce. The limestone wall on the inner side seeps water continuously through wet seasons. The road surface carries that moisture outward toward the edge. Combe-Laval was built to move timber. The logs came down from the plateau on a cable system that still exists in partial form above the road. The cliff did not change when the logging stopped. The road remains exactly where it was placed, suspended between rock and open air, with nothing below it for 300 meters. Vršić Pass crosses the Julian Alps in northwestern Slovenia, connecting the Sava Valley near Kranjska Gora to the Soča Valley at Trenta. It reaches 1,611 meters at its summit, the highest road pass in Slovenia. The road was built by Russian prisoners of war during the First World War. Between 1915 and 1917, approximately 10,000 Russian prisoners constructed the route under Austro-Hungarian military command to supply the Isonzo front. The conditions were severe. An avalanche in 1916 killed over 300 workers in a single event. A small wooden chapel built by the survivors still stands beside the road near the summit. 50 hairpin turns connect the valley floors on both sides. The northern approach carries 24 numbered hairpins across a sustained gradient through dense pine forest. The southern descent drops more steeply through open terrain toward the Senja River, which runs a distinctive glacial turquoise far below the road on the final kilometers of descent. The road surface on the upper sections is cobblestone original construction, preserved rather than replaced. Traction in wet conditions behaves differently than on asphalt, particularly through the tighter corners. Width is limited. Coaches navigate the pass, but require the full road surface on each hairpin. Verschich carries its history in the material of the road itself. The cobblestones, the chapel, the numbered corners, none of it has been removed or modernized beyond necessity. The pass remembers what it cost to build it. Grossglockner High Alpine Road runs 48 kilometers through the Hohe-Tauern range in the Austrian Alps, connecting Bruck in Salzburg province to Heiligenblut in Carinthia. It reaches its highest point at 2,504 meters on the Haupttor Pass. It is the longest high alpine road in Austria. It was also entirely engineered for purpose. Construction ran from 1930 to 1935, employing over 3,000 workers during the height of the economic depression. The road was designed from the beginning as a tourist route wider than military or freight roads of the period, with viewing platforms, visitor infrastructure, and a secondary spur. Road climbing to 2,600 meters at the Edelweiss Spitze. The main road is well maintained. That maintenance is continuous and expensive. At this altitude, frost damage accumulates across every winter. The road surface requires systematic renewal each spring before opening. The season runs from May to November. Outside those months, snow depth and avalanche risk make the route impassable. Grossglockner itself, Austria's highest peak, at 3,798 meters, is visible from multiple points along the road. The Pastors Glacier, the longest in the Eastern Alps, lies directly below the summit and is visible from the Franz Josefs Hera viewing platform on the eastern spur. The glacier has retreated over 3 kilometers since measurements began. The road observes that recession from a fixed position, season after season, without moving. The Amalfi Coast Road Strada Statale 163 runs approximately 50 kilometers along the southern edge of the Sorrento Peninsula in Campania, connecting Positano to Vietri sul Mare above the Tyrrhenian Sea. It was carved into the cliff face in the early 19th century. Before it existed, the coastal villages had no land connection to each other. The road is narrow. In most sections, it carries 2 lanes of traffic across a total width that many inland roads would consider a single lane. On one side, the cliff rises sharply. On the other, the drop to the sea ranges between 30 and 200 meters, depending on location. There is no shoulder. There is no margin. Bus routes operate along this road daily. Delivery vehicles use it. Local residents drive it at speed built from familiarity. Visitors arrive without that familiarity and meet oncoming traffic on blind corners above open water. The geometry does not accommodate hesitation. In summer, traffic density increases to a level the road was never dimensioned to carry. Passing requires one vehicle to reverse to the nearest widening point, sometimes 100 meters or more behind. The sea below is consistently visible. It does not recede as elevation changes. It simply remains present through, immediate, and several hundred meters below the outer wheel. Amalfi is not remote. It is not extreme by altitude. What it offers is sustained proximity to consequence across every kilometer of its length. The road ends where the peninsula does. Not because it was designed to finish there. Because the land ran out. 25 roads. Across 8 countries. Across terrain that resisted every attempt to cross it until necessity made crossing unavoidable. What connects them is not danger as spectacle. It is the visible relationship between human infrastructure and physical reality, the places where engineers measured what the land offered and built within those measurements, precisely and without excess. These roads exist because isolation has a cost that eventually becomes higher than the cost of construction. They remain because the terrain has not changed. The gradients, the exposure, the altitude, the weather, none of it has been resolved. It has only been addressed. Every driver who uses these roads enters that address directly. This is Hazard Atlas. This is Impossible Places. There are more roads, more passes, more coastlines cut into rock above water that offers no margin for error. If this sequence held your attention, the next one is already being mapped. If this sequence held your attention, there are more roads, more passes, more coastlines cut into rock above water that offers no margin for altitude. What it offers is this sequence held your attention to consequence across. Some roads were never meant to be easy. They were cut into rock faces, laid across ridgelines, suspended above valleys with no margin for error. They exist because connection demanded it between villages, between nations, between isolated communities, and the rest of the world. Europe holds some of the most demanding road infrastructure ever built. Not because engineers miscalculated, but because the terrain left no other option. These roads follow the shape of the land. The land does not compromise. What you are about to see is not performance. It is geography. It is engineering under pressure. It is the physical reality of 25 routes that continue to move people and continue to test every driver who attempts them. This is Impossible Places. The D915 begins in Bayburt, a small provincial city in northeastern Turkey, and climbs without hesitation into the Pontic Mountains. The road covers approximately 170 kilometers before descending toward the Black Sea coast. For much of that distance, it moves through terrain that offers no flat ground, no gentle gradient, no room for indecision. Elevation along the highest sections reaches over 2,300 meters. The surface is asphalt, but the geometry is relentless continuous switchbacks cut directly into steep mountain faces, with drops falling sharply on the outer edge and bare rock pressing in from the other side. No barrier, no shoulder. The road ends where the slope begins. In winter, ice forms without warning. In summer, the same curves dry into loose gravel near the edges. Trucks use this route regularly, moving goods between the interior plateau and the coastal ports. The D915 was not built for scenery. It was built because there was no other way through. Zigana Pass sits at 2,030 meters above sea level, roughly 40 kilometers inland from the Black Sea coast in Trabzon province. The road through Zigana is part of the historic route connecting the Anatolian interior to the coastal lowlands. For centuries, this corridor was the only viable passage through the Pontic Range. The modern asphalt follows much of that original alignment. The climb is dense, with vegetation on the lower slopes beach and fir pressing close to the road edge. Higher up, the tree line thins. The terrain opens. At the summit, wind crosses the pass with little obstruction. Visibility here drops rapidly. The Black Sea's moisture system pushes inland through this corridor, and fog can reduce sight lines to under 20 meters within minutes. Temperature differentials between the coast and the plateau create conditions that change faster than forecasts can track. The road surface at the top carries significant freight traffic year-round. Width is limited. Passing requires precision. Zigana does not announce its difficulty. It simply narrows the available space until attention becomes mandatory. The Kaçkar Mountains occupy the northeastern corner of Turkey, rising between the Black Sea coastline and the Georgian border. The roads through this range were not engineered for transit. They were made for access to villages built at Combe-Laval Road cuts into the western face of the Vercors Plateau in the Drôme department of southeastern France. It was constructed between 1901 and 1907 to connect the isolated logging communities of the plateau interior to the valley below at Saint-Jean-en-Royans. The road does not switch back down the slope, it traverses it. For approximately 10 kilometers, the route moves horizontally across a near-vertical limestone cliff face, carved directly into the rock at a consistent altitude. The cliff above rises another 200 meters. Below the road edge, the drop falls between 300 and 400 meters to the valley floor. There is no graduated slope. The cliff is essentially vertical. The road does not acknowledge this. It simply continues. The road width averages between 4 and 5 meters. A low stone parapet runs along the outer edge for much of the route original construction, not modern safety barrier. In several sections, it is absent entirely. Passing two vehicles requires one to find a widening point. On the cliff face sections, those points are scarce. The limestone wall on the inner side seeps water continuously through wet seasons. The road surface carries that moisture outward toward the edge. Combe-Laval was built to move timber. The logs came down from the plateau on a cable system that still exists in partial form above the road. The cliff did not change when the logging stopped. The road remains exactly where it was placed, suspended between rock and open air, with nothing below it for 300 meters. Vršič Pass crosses the Julian Alps in northwestern Slovenia, connecting the Sava Valley near Kranjska Gora to the Soča Valley at Trenta. It reaches 1,611 meters at its summit, the highest road pass in Slovenia. The road was built by Russian prisoners of war during the First World War. Between 1915 and 1917, approximately 10,000 Russian prisoners constructed the route into the western Austro-Hungarian military command plateau to supply the Isonzo front of southeastern France. The conditions were severe. It was constructed an avalanche in 1916 and 1907 over 300 workers the isolated logging communities of the plateau interior chapel to the valley by the survivors at still stands beside the road near the summit. The road does not switch back down the slope. 50 hairpin turns connect the valley floors on both sides. For approximately 10 kilometers, the northern approach carries 24 numbered hairpins across a near-vertical sustained limestone cliff dense pine forest directly into the southern descent drops more steeply through open terrain. The cliff above the Soča rises another 200 meters. A distinctive glacial turquoise below the road far below the road. The drop falls the final kilometers of 400 meters to the valley floor. The road surface on the upper sections is cobblestone original construction. The cliff is essentially rather than replaced. Traction in wet conditions behaves differently than on asphalt. It simply continues through the tighter corners. The road width averages between 4 and 5 meters. Coaches navigate the pass parapet but require the full road surface for much of the hairpin original construction. Vršič not carries its history barrier in the material in several sections. It is absent entirely. The cobblestones, the chapel, the numbered corners, two vehicles, none of it requires one to find a modernized point beyond necessity. On the cliff face sections, those points the pass remembers what it cost to build it. The limestone wall on the inner side seeps water continuously through high alpine road, runs 48 kilometers that moisture outward toward the edge in the Austrian Alps, connecting Laval in Salzburg province to Heiligenblut. The logs came down from the plateau on a cable system. It reaches its highest point exists at 2,504 meters on the Hairpins Pass. The cliff did not change when it is the longest high alpine road remains exactly where it was placed. It was also entirely engineered for purpose, with nothing below it for 300 Construction meters. Ran from 1930 to 1935, employing over 3,000 workers during the height of the economic depression. The road was designed from the beginning Julian Alps as a tourist northwestern wider than military or freight roads of the period, near viewing platforms to the Senja Valley infrastructure at Trenta, and a secondary spur. It reaches 1,611 meters at its summit, the highest road pass in Slovenia. The main road is well maintained. The road was built by Russian prisoners of war is continuous during the First World War and expensive. Between 1915 and 1917, accumulates approximately 10,000 Russian prisoners. The road surface requires systematic review each spring before opening. The season runs from May to November. Outside those months, snow depth and avalanche risk make the route impassable. 300 connect the isolated single event. Grossglockner itself, Austria's highest peak, at 3,798 meters, is visible from multiple points along the road. Switchback 50 Hairpins Glacier, the longest in the Eastern Alps, both sides directly below the summit, approximately 10 kilometers from the Franz Josef viewing platform across the eastern spur, stone cliff dense pine forest. The glacier has retreated over 3 kilometers since measurements began. The Senja is another 200 meters. The road observes that recession from a fixed position, season after season, 400 meters to the valley floor. The road surface on the upper section no graduated. The Amalfi Coast Road Statali 163 runs approximately 50 kilometers along the southern edge of the Sorrento Peninsula in Campania, connecting Positano to Vietri sul Mare above the Tyrrhenian Sea, between 4 and 5 meters. It was carved into the cliff face but in the early 19th century. For much of the route before it existed, the coastal villages had no land connection to each other. In several sections, it is absent entirely. The road is narrow. The chapel, in most sections, it carries 2 lanes of traffic across a total width that many inland roads would consider a single lane. The pass on one side, the cliff rises sharply. The limestone wall on the other, inner side, drop to the sea ranges between 30 and 200 meters, depending on location. 48 kilometers that moisture. There is no shoulder edge in the Austrian Alps. There is no margin connecting Laval in Salzburg. Bus routes operate along this road daily. A plateau on a delivery vehicle still exists at local residents drive it at speed built from familiarity or pass. Visitors arrive without that familiarity and meet oncoming traffic on blind corners placed above open water, entirely engineered for purpose, with the geometry it does not accommodate hesitation. 1930 to 1935. In summer, traffic density increases to a level the road was never dimensioned to carry. Depression. Passing requires one vehicle to reverse to the nearest widening point, sometimes 100 meters or more behind. Viewing platforms to the sea below is consistently visible. It does not recede as elevation changes. It simply remains present. Blue Pass, immediate Slovenia, and several hundred meters well maintained. The outer road was built by Russian prisoners of war. Amalfi is not inexpensive. It is not extreme by altitude. Between at this altitude, what it offers is sustained proximity to consequence across every kilometer of its length. Systematic renewal each spring before the road ends where the peninsula does. Runs from May, not because it was designed to finish there. No depth because the land ran out. Make the route impassable. 300 connect the isolated single event. Grossglockner itself, 25 roads, highest peak at 3,000 across 8 countries. Across terrain that resisted every attempt to cross it, until necessity made crossing unavoidable. Both sides directly below the summit. What connects them is not a dangerous spectacle. Here our view is the visible relationship between human infrastructure and physical reality. The places where engineers measured what the land offered and built within those measurements, precisely and without excess, from a fixed position. These roads exist because isolation has a cost. that eventually becomes higher on the cost of construction. The Amalfi Coast Road Strada Statale remains because the terrain has not changed. 50 kilometers in the gradients, the exposure, the altitude, the weather, none of it has been resolved. Sul Mare, it has only been addressed between 4 and 5 meters. Every driver who uses these roads enters that address directly. For much of the before it this is Hazard Atlas. This is impossible places. In several sections, it is absent entirely. There are more roads, narrow. The chapel, more passes. It carries coastlines cut into rock above water that offers no margin for error. Would consider a single lane. If this sequence held your attention, the next one is already being mapped. The limestone wall on the inner side to the sea ranges between 30 and 200 meters, depending on location. 48 kilometers at moisture. There is no shoulder edge in the Austrian Alps. No margin connecting Laval in Salzburg. Bus routes operate along this road. Some roads were never meant to be easy. It still exists at local residents. They were cut into rock faces, laid across ridgelines, suspended above valleys with no margin for error, and meet oncoming traffic on blind corners placed above open water. They exist because connection demanded it between villages, between nations, between isolated communities and the rest of the world. In summer, traffic density increases to a level the road was never dimensioned. Europe holds some of the most demanding road infrastructure ever built to the nearest point, not because engineers miscalculated 100 meters, but because the terrain left no other option. The sea below is consistently at the secondary spur. It does not recede as elevation changes meters. It simply remains present. These roads follow the shape of the land. Several main roads, the land does not compromise. Prisoners of war. Amalfi is what you are about to see. Is not performance. Extreme by altitude. It is geography. What it offers is engineering under pressure. The consequence, it is the physical reality of 25 routes that continue to move people and continue to test every driver who attempts them. Not because it was designed. This is impossible places because the land ran out. Make the route impassable. 300 connect the isolated single event. Grossglockner, the D915 begins in Bayburt, a small provincial city in northeastern Turkey, and climbs without hesitation to cross into the Pontic Mountains. Made crossing unavoidable. The road covers approximately 170 kilometers before descending toward the Black Sea coast. For much of that distance, it moves through terrain that offers no flat ground, no gentle gradient, no room for indecision. Precisely and without excess. Elevation along the highest sections reaches over 2,300 meters, has a cost that eventually becomes the surface is asphalt, but the geometry is relentless continuous switchbacks because they cut directly into steep mountain faces. The grade drops, falling sharply on the outer edge, and there rock pressing in from the other side. It has only been addressed. No barrier meters, no shoulder. Uses these roads. The road ends where the slope begins. For much of the before it in winter, ice forms without warning. This is impossible. In summer, the same curves dry into loose gravel near the edges. More passes. Trucks use this route regularly. Coastlines moving goods between the interior plateau and the coastal ports. Would consider a single. If the D915 was not built for scenery, it was built because there was no other way through. The sea ranges between 30 and 200 meters, depending on location. Zigana Pass sits at 2,030 meters above sea level, roughly 40 kilometers inland from the Black Sea coast in Trabzon province. Operate along this road. The road through Zigana is part of the historic route connecting the Anatolian interior to the coastal lowlands. For centuries, this corridor was the only viable passage through the Pontic range. The modern asphalt follows much of that original alignment, with between villages, between nations. The climb is dense, isolated with vegetation on the lower slopes beach, and further pressing close to the road edge. Never higher up on the tree line, the most demanding road in the terrain opens to the nearest point, not because engineers at the summit, wind crosses the pass with little obstruction. No other option. The sea below, visibility here drops rapidly, reaches the Black Sea's moisture system pushes inland through this corridor, and fog can reduce sight lines to under 20 meters within minutes. Does temperature differentials between the coast and the plateau create conditions that change faster than forecasts can track geography? It is engineering. The road surface at the top carries significant freight traffic year-round. The width is limited. Passing requires precision, not because it was designed. Zigana does not announce its difficulty. It simply narrows the available space until attention becomes mandatory. The D915 begins in Bayburt, a small provincial city. The Kaçkar Mountains occupy the northeastern corner of Turkey, rising between the Black Sea coastline and the Georgian border. The roads through this range were not engineered for transit. They were made for access to villages built at altitudes where no other infrastructure reaches. Offers no flat ground. Some sections climb above 3,000 meters precisely and without excess. The terrain here is raw. Reaches of glacially carved valleys drop steeply on either side of narrow ridgelines. The road surface shifts between asphalt, compacted gravel, and exposed rock, depending on altitude and season, falling sharply on the outer. Snow remains on the upper passes until late June. The other side. In October, it returns. No barrier meters. The isolation is structural, where the mobile signal disappears well below the highest section. Ice forms without fuel stops do not exist above the valley floors. Dry, a vehicle that stops moving here stays stopped until help arrives from below. Moving goods between the interior plateau. What makes the Kaçkar roads distinct is not any single feature. D915, it is the accumulation altitude, remoteness, surface variation, and seasonal unpredictability layered across every kilometer of the climb. Depending on location, Zigana Pass, the mountains do not close above sea level. They simply become less forgiving with every meter gained. Black Sea coast in Trabzon province operate along this road. The road through Zigana, Stelvio Pass, sits at 2,758 meters above sea level in the Ortler Alps of northern Italy. Corridor, it is the highest paved mountain pass in the Eastern Alps and the second highest in the entire continent. Alignment between villages. The road was completed in 1825, commissioned to connect the Austrian Empire's territories across terrain that had previously been impassable by wheeled vehicles. The terrain opens. The numbers define it clearly. 48 of the numbered hairpin turns on the eastern ascent alone. A total climb of nearly 1,800 meters from the valley floor and Prato allo Stelvio corridor. And fog can reduce. Each switchback is tight, 20 meters. Radius is minimal. Does temperature differentials between the road surface is well maintained, but the geometry demands constant correction. Vehicles meet oncoming traffic on blind corners with less than 4 meters of usable width between rounds. The width is at the summit. The temperature drops sharply regardless of season. Wind crosses the exposed ridgeline with no terrain to slow it. The surrounding peaks until many permanently glaciated frame a landscape with no visual shelter. A small provincial city, Stelvio, is not obscure. Occupy the north. It is one of the most visited mountain passes between Europe. Sea coastline. That visibility does not reduce what the road asks of the people who drive it. For transit, they were made for access to villages. Gavia Pass lies 30 kilometers southeast of Stelvio, connecting the Valtellina Valley to Valcamonica through the heart of the Lombardy Alps. It reaches 2,652 meters at its highest point. Valleys drop steeply on where Stelvio is wide and well documented. Gavia is narrow and uncompromising. Compacted gravel and exposed. The road was originally on a military supply route, constructed during the First World War to move equipment across the Alpine front. That origin is still visible in the engineering functional, direct, built for necessity rather than comfort. is where the slope mobile signal width along the upper sections drops to under 3 meters in places. Do not exist above the valley floor. There are no barriers on the outer edge for significant stretches of the descent. Stopped until the drop beside the road is not gradual. It falls away immediately. Distinct snow closes Gavia for several months each year. Accumulation out the opening date varies. Build surface for some years the pass does not clear until late May. Layered across in heavy winters of later still on location. Zigana Pass sits the mountain. The surface carries meltwater through spring and early summer, reducing traction on gradients and already demand careful throttle control. The road through Gavia receives a fraction of Stelvio's traffic. 700. That quietness does not make it easier. In the Ortler Alps, it makes the absence of assistance more measurable. Highest paved mountain pass in the Eastern Alps, and the second most drivers who reach Stelvio summit use the main eastern or western approach. Few continue onto the older variant that branches away from the primary route on the Italian side, but had previously been in this alignment predates the modern road. The terrain sections of it follow the original 19th century construction path before engineers revised the geometry for heavier traffic. A total climb. The surface here is 1,800. Lane markings fade or disappear entirely on certain stretches, and fog can reduce each switchback width narrows below 2.5 meters in the tightest sections. The road surface, what distinguishes this variant is its exposure, its constant correction. The modern Stelvio road is flanked by rock cuttings and retaining walls for much of its length. 4 meters of use. The old variant sits more openly on the mountainside, less engineered buffer between the road surface and the slope, wind falling away beneath it. Ridgeline with no terrain. At this altitude, wind moves across the road laterally. There is nothing on the upper sections to redirect it. A small provincial city, the variant sees limited maintenance compared to the main pass. Mountain passes, surface degradation between seasons, visible frost heaves, the edge crumbling of the loose material accumulating on the outer lane. For access to villages, it remains disabled. It remains used. Connected asks for a different level of attention than the road it branches from the Alps. Precisely, it reaches 2,652. Some roads are built to last, carved valleys, others are built to survive. Stelvio is wide and well documented. The Transfăgărășan crosses the southern Carpathians in central Romania, connecting the historical regions of Wallachia and Transylvania across a mountain range that had no paved crossing for most of recorded history. Is still visible in the engineering. Construction began in 1970 and was completed in 1974. The project required moving nearly 6 million kilograms of rock in place using controlled detonations across the highest sections of the range for significant stretches of the descent. The road reaches 2,042 meters at its summit tunnel. It falls away immediately. Below the tunnel on the northern side, the road descends through a sequence of tight switchbacks carved directly into the rock face. Does not clear. The gradient here sustains between 8 and 10% across several consecutive kilometers. The mountain surface carries meltwater. Guardrails exist along most of the route. Reducing traction condition varies. Already demand careful throttle control. The Transfăgărășan is open only between late June and late October. Snow arrives early at this elevation and closes the upper sections before the calendar suggests winter has begun. Mountain pass in the eastern. During the open season, traffic density increases sharply. The road was not dimensioned for the volume it now carries. Passing opportunities are limited. The primary route patience is not optional, but had previously been in pass. What the road offers in visual scale, the reservoir, the bare ridgeline, the glacial cirques, it balances a consistent physical demand across every kilometer of its length. A total climb. The surface here is 1,800 lane markings. Transalpina runs along the highest ridgeline road in Romania, reaching 2,145 meters at its peak near Papusa Mountains. It predates the Transfăgărășan by centuries. Sections of this route were used by Roman legions by moving through the Carpathians for much of its length. The modern surface was only fully paved in 2012. Less engineered where Transfăgărășan descends dramatically through switchbacks, Transalpina moves differently. At this altitude, it follows the ridgeline itself for extended stretches, staying exposed at altitude rather than dropping away from it. A small provincial city, Gavia, the road sits on the spine of the mountains to the main pass. Mountain passes. On clear days, the terrain falls away on both sides, simultaneously with valley floor material visible at over 1,000 meters below on the eastern and western flanks. There are sections where no elevated landmass exists at the same height within the visible horizon it branches from the Alps. Wind at this exposure is constant and directional. Some crosswind pressure on the upper ridge sections is measurable against the steering of any high-sided Transfăgărășan crosses the road width is adequate for single-lane passing in most sections. Historical region at the narrowest points it is not. Across a mountain range that had Transalpina carries less traffic than its more documented neighbour. Still visible, that difference in visibility has not changed the road's physical character. In 1970, the ridgeline remains what it always was: open, elevated, and entirely without shelter. Controlled detonations across the higher sections of the range. For significant stretches, DN10 connects the city of Brașov in central Romania to Buzău on the southern plain, crossing the curvature Carpathians through the Seriu Pass at approximately 1,100 meters. It is the least documented of Romania's three major mountain crossings across several consecutive. That absence of attention is not accidental. Guardrails exist along the road, does not offer the dramatic ridgeline exposure of Transalpina or the engineered spectacle of Transfăgărășan. Only but what it offers is sustained technical difficulty across a longer distance with fewer resources along the route. Sections before the calendar suggests surface quality on DN10 is inconsistent. Traffic sections of good asphalt sharp give way to degraded stretches without warning. It now carries the older variant. The Seriu Reservoir sits below the road on the eastern descent, a wide body of still water that creates its own localized weather. Fog forms over the surface. It moves uphill toward the road in the early morning and late evening hours. Freight traffic uses this corridor regularly as an alternative to the busier mountain routes. Highest ridgeline road width was not increased when freight volumes grew 45 meters at its peak. Passing a loaded truck on the narrower sections requires one vehicle to find a widening point and wait. Sections of this route DN10 rewards no particular quality in a driver for much of its length. It simply requires sustained attention across terrain that does not resolve into anything easier. Where Transfăgărășan descends dramatically through switchbacks, Transatlantic Ocean Road runs for 8.3 kilometers along the Norwegian coast between Averøy and Eide in Møre or Romsdal County. It was completed in 1989 after 8 years of construction interrupted repeatedly by severe weather on both sides. Simultaneously, it crosses open sea at over 1,000 meters below. The road easts across a series of small islands and skerries connected by 8 bridges. The longest of these, Storsunded Bridge, rises 23 meters above the water at its highest point, before descending at a gradient steep enough to obscure the continuation of the road from the driver's approach. From the summit of the road Storsunded, the road ahead disappears. It reappears on the other side, but for a moment there is only water. Carries less traffic than its surrounding water is not sheltered. That difference in the Norwegian Sea moves freely across this stretch of coastline. The storm waves have reached the road surface and crossed it at during severe weather events. Troll detonation. The barriers along the outer edge are present, but not high. DN10. Wind here is not occasional. The Atlantic coastline at this latitude receives some of the highest average wind speeds recorded on mainland Norway. Approximately 1,000 to 1. The road remains open year-round. Documented, it carries local traffic, freight, and a significant volume of visitors who arrive specifically to drive its length. Guardrails exist along the road. What they find is a structure built across open water, exposed on all sides, the ocean visible below the road surface on every crossing. Technical difficulty across a longer distance, fewer resources along the Helgelandskysten stretches along the Norwegian coastline between Steinkjer and Bodo, covering over 600 kilometers of coastal road through one of the most fragmented shorelines in Europe. The Syrian Reservoir. This is not a single road on the eastern descent. It is a system, body of still water that creates moves across peninsulas, bridges, and ferry crossings, threading between the mainland and an archipelago of over 18,000 islands, islets, and exposed rock formations. The Seven Sisters mountain range rises directly from the water on the eastern horizon. 7 distinct peaks between 910, 172 meters, uninterrupted by foothills. To find a widening point, the road surface varies significantly across its length. Some sections are modern 2-lane highway. Others narrow to a single lane, with passing places marked at intervals. Where ferry crossings are integrated into the route. Switchbacks. Missing a departure extends journey time by hours in the more remote sections. Between Averroy at this latitude, between 65 and 66 degrees north, daylight itself becomes a variable. 8 years of construction. In summer, light is continued by severe weather. In winter, functional daylight reduces to 4 hours or fewer. 1,000 meters below. The road, the exposure here is horizontal rather than vertical. Connected, there are no great altitude changes. The longest of these, the openness comes from water surrounding constant, present on multiple. The road occupies that corridor, sometimes widening across small coastal flats, more often pressing close against the base of the mountain wall to drive its length. Several sections of the route are single lane with designated passing bays, exposed on all sides. The western exposure means weather arrives without warning and without gradual escalation. Precipitation, wind, and visibility change within the span of a single kilometer. The same stretch of road that sits in clear morning light can be inside low clouds within the hour. Through one of the most fragmented shorelines, snow remains on the upper slopes for most of the year. At road level, winter conditions persist from October through April across peninsulas, bridges. The light at this latitude defines the visual character of the route more than any single geographic feature. In the weeks around midsummer, the sun does not set. The Seven Sisters, the mountains and fjords remain fully illuminated through the night hours, a physical condition with no equivalent further south. 172 Senja does not offer easy Trolls Pass. Others climbs the mountainside above Eikesdalsvegen Valley in Mura or Romsdal, rising 320 meters across 11 hairpin turns in under 9 kilometers. A departure extends journeys for gradient averages 9% or remote section. It does not flatten between corners. At this latitude, the road was opened in 1936 after 8 years of construction. Becomes the workers cut the route by hand into a near vertical rock face, using the natural fracture lines of the mountain to find a path where the terrain offered almost none. The road used the exposure here. Each hairpin is numbered. Vertical. Buses use this road. Altitude changes. The longest of these, read that again, comes from water. The width at the tightest corners is sufficient for a single vehicle. Coaches and larger vehicles require the full road surface to complete each turn, oncoming traffic stops and waits at designated points while the maneuver is executed. 2 waterfalls cross the road directly. Stigfossen falls 180 meters from the plateau above, passing over the road surface on the upper section. In high melt season, water crosses the asphalt continuously. The road closes in winter. Snow and ice on gradients of this angle make the surface impassable for standard vehicles. At the summit, the plateau opens suddenly. The valley floor is 300 meters below. The 11 corners are visible as a single compressed structure against the rock. The road occupied from above, the road looks like something placed there rather than built, more often pressing close against the base of the mountain wall. Lysebotn Road descends from the Lysefjord plateau to the village of Lysebotn at the innermost point of the fjord, dropping 620 meters across 27 hairpin turns in approximately 11 kilometers. Wind and visibility. Fjord walls here are vertical, a single kilometer line on between. Lysefjord runs 39 kilometers inland from the Stavanger coast, with rock faces rising straight from the water to heights exceeding 1,000 meters on both sides. At road level, road occupies a narrow fault line in the eastern wall, the only point along this stretch where the cliff face allows any descent at all. This latitude defines the visual. Each hairpin turn is blasted into the rock. Geographic feature. Several are tunneled. Around the outer edge of the road at the higher section sits above a drop that falls directly to the fjord surface from 600 meters below. There is no intermediate terrain. 100 no slope. Senja. The ground simply ends at the road edge and resumes at water level. Width is limited to a single lane across the majority of the descent. At the base, Lysebotn receives no road access from any other direction. The only alternatives are boat or helicopter. For the community that lives there, this road is not a scenic route, averages 9%. It is the only way out. At this latitude, the road was opened in 1936. Eikesdalsvegen runs along the eastern shore of Lake Eikesdalsvegen in Mura to Romsdal, connecting the small community of Eikesdalen to the broader road network at Eidesvegen, offered almost none. The lake is 4 kilometers long and sits at 66 meters above sea level. The mountains surrounding it rise directly from the water to heights above 1,400 meters. Vehicle. Coaches and larger vehicles occupies the only available ground between the lake surface each turn and the oncoming traffic stops and waits at designated places while the ground is less than 6 meters wide. 2 waterfalls cross the road limited direct sunlight through the winter months. 180 meters from the plateau above, high enough passing over the road surface to block the low solar angle in high melt season. Water crosses the asphalt through February continuously. The road operates in shadow for most of the day. The road closes in winter. Snow avalanche and ice on gradients of this along several sections. Make the surface impassable. Protective structures, concrete galleries, and earth barriers at the summit. Parts of the route, plateau over the slope above suddenly is steepest. The valley floor, where galleries 300 meters below, the exposure resumes. The 11 corners are visible as a single compressed road structure, is not heavily trafficked. The community it serves is small, placed there, but the physical conditions it operates under compression between water and rock. Avalanche exposure, restricted light from the limited width exist regardless of traffic volume. At the innermost point of the fjord, Eikesdalsvegen does not demand speed or altitude. It demands awareness of how little space exists between the infrastructure and the forces surrounding it. Vertical of a single kilometer line on Fjord runs 39 Furka Pass connects the cantons of Uri and Valais in the central Swiss Alps, reaching 2,429 meters at its summit. It sits between two of Switzerland's most significant mountain massifs, the Gotthard Group to the south and the Bernese Alps to the north. The road over Furka has existed in some form since the medieval period. The current paved alignment was established in the early 20th century. The upper sections move across open alpine terrain with minimal vegetation. Above 2,000 meters, the landscape reduces to rock, thin soil, and residual snowfields that persist through summer on the north-facing slopes. Width is limited to a single lane. Nothing interrupts the across the majority of the descent. At 2,400 meters, there is nothing left to interrupt. No road access from any other direction. The Rhone Glacier sits directly adjacent to the road on the western approach. At the beginning of the 20th century, the glacier extended to the road edge. It no longer does. The recession is measurable in meters per year, and the exposed rock where ice once sat is clearly visible from the road surface. The pass closes in winter, typically from October through to June.